Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
It was supposed to be a celebration, though I've learned that in my family, celebrations are just wars in nicer clothes. The house smelled like cake and wine. The table was set with the good china that only came out when there were witnesses, and my mother, Margaret Carter, sat at the head of the table like she was hosting a royal banquet instead of her own birthday dinner in suburban Ohio. I was seated 3 chairs down, beside a cousin I barely knew and across from my brother Daniel, who'd arrived late and kissed Mom's cheek like a movie star greeting a fan. He had that easy charm she always fell for, the kind that could sell you an empty box and make you thank him for it. I remember the way the light hit her wine glass when she stood up to speak, golden reflections on red liquid, a tiny cathedral of ego and Chardonnay. Her smile was polished and cruel, the same smile she used when neighbors asked about her kids. She always said Daniel's in finance, doing wonderfully, then paused, sighed, and added, Emily's still, figuring things out. I'd gotten used to that pause. It was like my entire existence lived inside it. That night, she cleared her throat dramatically, like she was preparing for a performance. I just want to say how proud I am, she began, eyes sweeping the room, lingering on Daniel. My son has worked so hard. He's building something real, something stable. A future. Then she turned her gaze to me, not cold, not even angry, just amused. And Emily, well, she tries. Bless her heart. The laughter that followed was quiet, unsure, like everyone at the table felt the temperature drop but didn't want to admit it. I forced a smile, though my hand trembled slightly around the stem of my glass. I'd heard worse from her, much worse, but there was something about the way she said it, the casual cruelty wrapped in celebration, that felt like she'd just carved me open in front of everyone. She loved moments like this, the subtle power of humiliation dressed as humor. My mother didn't raise her voice when she wanted to hurt you. She just found the sharpest word, coated it in sugar, and served it with dessert. She lifted her glass higher. And let's be honest, she continued, her voice rising like a sermon, not a cent for you, dear. You're a lifelong disappointment, but at least you're entertaining. Daniel chuckled, maybe out of discomfort, maybe because he knew better than to challenge her. The rest of the table went silent. The air seemed to thicken, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I felt the blood rush to my face, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I raised my own glass, met her eyes, and said, calmly, that's fine. I won't be around anyway. She blinked, caught off guard by my tone. What's that supposed to mean? She asked, still smiling, but there was a crack in her voice, a faint, fragile sound I hadn't heard before. I took another slow sip, tasted the bitter sweetness of the wine, and said evenly, I'm leaving the country for good. The words landed like a punch in a church. Someone dropped a fork. Daniel's wife whispered something to him, but I didn't care to hear. My mother froze, her expression collapsing just enough to betray the panic behind her painted confidence. She wasn't expecting me to say anything real. She'd built her entire identity on my silence, on the idea that I'd always take her insults, absorb them, and smile through the pain. But that night, I decided I was done playing her mirror. For a second, she laughed, a short, nervous sound. Oh, don't be dramatic, Emily. You always make everything about you. I didn't reply. I just looked at her the way a stranger might, curious, detached, tired. The clock on the wall ticked louder than the conversation that followed. People tried to pick up where she'd left off, talking about Daniel's new condo, about a vacation in Florida, about anything that didn't involve me. I sat there, drinking quietly, feeling my pulse slow down, as if a door inside me had finally closed. Later, when the cake came out, she made a point to cut me the smallest slice. Watching her figure, she said lightly. I smiled, but it was a different kind of smile, the kind that hides a secret. I wasn't angry anymore. That was the strange part. I'd spent my whole life carrying the weight of her disappointment, thinking if I could just do something right, get a better job, dress the way she liked, marry someone she approved of, she'd finally see me. But that night, as she laughed too loudly and sipped her wine like it was oxygen, I realized something quietly devastating. She never would. After dessert, I stood up, kissed her cheek, and whispered, "Happy birthday, Mom. Enjoy your kingdom." She smirked, not realizing it was a farewell. I left the house before anyone noticed, stepping into the cold night air that smelled faintly of lilacs and cigarette smoke. My car waited at the curb like an accomplice. I sat inside for a long moment, staring at the house, the warm windows glowing like a stage I'd finally walked off. I thought about all the years she'd mocked my choices, my failed marriage, my freelance jobs, the way I never seemed to settle. And yet, for the first time, I felt steady. There was something liberating about knowing I owed her nothing, not my explanation, not my presence, not even my anger. When I started the engine, the headlights cut through the darkness, and I realized I wasn't just leaving a dinner. I was leaving a story that had never belonged to me. As I drove away, my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. What the hell was that about? I didn't answer. The road stretched ahead, empty and silver under the streetlights, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking back. That night, I didn't go home. I drove to the airport parking lot and just sat there until dawn, watching planes lift into the sky, one after another, like tiny declarations of freedom. I didn't have a ticket yet, but I knew I would. And when I finally did, she'd hear about it the way she heard about everything else that mattered too late. On the drive back from the airport lot, with the sky turning that washed-out steel color that always makes Ohio look like it pressed snooze on the sun, I let my brain unspool the tape that I usually keep locked in a drawer, the one labeled "Stop Thinking About It." It won't change, and instead of fast-forwarding past the parts that hurt, I let them play at regular speed, because if I was serious about leaving, if I was finished performing daughterhood for an audience that booed between courses, then I needed to admit how long the show had been rigged and how early I learned that the applause was reserved for someone else. I could see it as clearly as the green exit signs flicking past my windshield, school concerts where my solo was a footnote, but Daniel's trumpet got the standing ovation, and the new camcorder, prom night where my thrift store dress was creative, and his rented tux was a promise of leadership, a freshman year dorm move-in where she forgot the shower caddy butt. Remembered to lecture me about my phase hair, then spent the afternoon arranging Daniel's posters straight as if an inch of crooked would tilt his life. Holidays where she handed him envelopes and handed me advice. Housewarmings where she brought him cookware and brought me a scented candle with a receipt tucked inside like a reminder not to get too attached. What I never said aloud, even to Lisa, who would have understood and passed me a coffee, and that look she has when she's ready to help me pack a bag, is that the favoritism came with a strange mercy for me. Because it meant the rules were different depending on who you were, and once I understood that I could stop pretending the game was fair, which is its own kind of freedom, though it doesn't feel like it when you're the one with the cheap shoes and the nice personality. I tried an infinite number of pivots, the way companies say they're restructuring when they mean they fired you, telling myself that if I just picked something stable or flashy or clean enough for suburban bragging rights, if I learned to talk about retirement accounts at backyard barbecues and stopped wearing boots in July, maybe then she would stand next to me like we were on the same team and not like I was the relative you apologize for in parking lots. Instead, every choice was a fresh exhibit in her private museum of my alleged chaos, and every time I asked for help, even the kind she could have given without blinking, she took a slow breath and said she needed to be careful about enabling me. As if love were a dangerous substance you only dispense with a pharmacist present. I pulled into my apartment complex and sat in the car because it had become a habit that night, this parking lot stillness where I could think without hearing her voice bounce around my head like a pinball machine, and I opened the family group chat. The one she curated like a public garden, all photos of grilled salmon and grandbaby pajamas and slightly aggressive Bible verses, and after staring at the cursor long enough to reconsider my entire personality, I typed a short thank you for the beautiful evening and attached the voice memo I had recorded during the toast, the one where her voice landed that line like a punchline carved out of bone. I didn't caption it, I didn't snark, I didn't explain, because I have learned that in certain households truth is most explosive when you don't add nitroglycerin. You simply set it gently on the table and let the oxygen do its work. And I hit send and watched the tiny delivered checkmarks bloom blue. The replies started in minutes, staggered and polite, like people choosing chairs after a fire alarm. A cousin asking if the audio had been edited because it sounded harsh. An aunt who never takes sides writing that she hoped everyone would take a breath and remember that birthdays can be emotional. Daniel with the kind of text that tries to swaddle harm in a blanket of reason, telling me Mom went too far but was obviously joking, and that I shouldn't make a thing of it, which is the language of a person who has never had to carry a thing very far. I did not answer him, but I did something small that felt like pulling a splinter, a practical revenge I could feel in my muscles. I opened the bank app and canceled the autopay I had set up 2 years earlier for her streaming service bundle. A patch I had offered back when she could not figure out passwords, and I believed utility counted as love, and I put the saved amount into an account labeled Escape, because money is a boundary you can measure, and every dollar I kept out of her kingdom made the drawbridge a little lighter to lift. Sleep did not come quickly, so I made coffee that tasted like penance and started a list titled, What I Keep, which included my grandmother's ring, the stand mixer I bought with a tax refund, my passport, and the photos of my father that Mom never liked because he looked at the camera with tenderness, as if he were photographing the person behind the lens and not the furniture around her. The thing about building a life under a critic is that you catalog everything in case you ever have to justify it, so it did not surprise me that the list grew long enough to make me wonder whether I had already left in spirit. And by the time the new sun made itself known without enthusiasm, I had washed the wine out of my veins with practical tasks, deleting the family group thread from my phone so I wouldn't watch it churn, drafting a kind email to my freelance clients explaining that my availability would shift for an extended period of travel, and pulling down a dusty shoebox of old papers. Because it had my name on the lid and I am superstitious enough to take that seriously. Inside the box, beneath expired commuter cards and a college brochure with a smiling girl I once thought I could become, I found a thin manila envelope with my mother's tidy handwriting, the kind she uses for holiday cards and moral judgments. And when I slid out the contents, it felt like someone opened a window in a room I didn't know was suffocating me, because there on the letterhead I recognized my father's life insurance company, and below the policy number I saw not one beneficiary but two, split evenly, with a handwritten note stapled to the corner that said, "Process to Daniel," in a clerk's careful pen. I held the paper a long time, that slow, cold heat flushing my face the way humiliation does. But this was not humiliation, this was arithmetic, and in the margin someone had circled a figure big enough to tilt a life. My phone lit up with a new message from Daniel about a great deal he and Mom had found on a downtown condo last spring, and how sometimes families help each other to make smart moves, and I stared at the screen and at the paper and at the shoebox that had lived in my closet like a quiet witness, and for the first time since the toast I laughed out loud. A low steady sound that tasted like metal and relief. Because the story I had been fed all these years about my wastefulness had just met a ledger. I folded the documents back into the envelope, placed it on the table like a chess piece I had finally learned to use, and opened a new browser tab for international flights with a one-way filter and a little checkbox for flexible dates. Because I could feel the shape of a plan hardening in my chest, not wild, not dramatic, just confident, and while the kettle started to hum for another cup, I drafted one more message, this time to myself, a promise written in plain language that even my mother would understand if she ever saw it. This is not running, this is arriving. By the time the kettle clicked off and the page of flight options refreshed into columns of city names that sounded like choices and not fantasies, the envelope sat in the middle of my table with the quiet authority of a judge taking a seat. And I understood that what I had nursed as a vague suspicion all these years, the sense that affection in our family traveled on receipts and routing numbers, was not neurotic bookkeeping but a map that, if followed, would lead straight to the room where decisions were made and signatures were witnessed while I was told to be grateful for candles and advice. I put my passport on top of the envelope because symbols matter to me, then opened my laptop camera and took a slow series of photographs, policy page, beneficiary designation, the clerk's note in a tidy hand that said, "Process to Daniel," And the date that lined up with the spring mom had insisted I was irresponsible for asking about a short-term loan, the same week she praised Daniel for taking initiative and told me that self-control and delayed gratification would make me stronger than any check ever could, a sermon that felt noble until I saw the math. I am not a lawyer, and I am not naive enough to play one on the internet, so my next search was not for revenge fantasies or inspirational quotes about boundaries, but for the most boring thing that real life uses to change itself, process. Which is to say, I looked up beneficiary disputes and claim files and what rights, if any, a person has when an employer policy becomes a widow's instrument and a mother turns executor of narrative and funds. And while 1,000 forums yelled at me in caps lock, a single calm article laid out something concrete. I could request the claim file from the insurer. I could send a written notice disputing distribution if I had reason to believe the paperwork was altered or misapplied. And I could do the least cinematic and most powerful act available to the chronically underestimated, which is to create a paper trail so clean it makes other people's memories nervous. I drafted a letter with the kind of clarity I reserve for invoices and heartbreak attached. The scans asked for the complete administrative record associated with my father's policy, and scheduled a morning appointment at the notary desk in the UPS store because nothing says "I mean it" like a stamp that smells faintly of ink and bureaucracy. Only then did I call my mother, because I wanted to speak while the train of my reasoning was still warm, and because I know her theater better than she knows my patience. She answered on the second ring with the brittle brightness she uses for people she plans to scold, and before she could collect her lines I told her I had found Dad's policy and the note, and that I would be requesting the claim file and any communications that led to an outcome where one beneficiary was a whole son and the other beneficiary was a life lesson. There was a long silence, not the stunned kind from the dinner, but the calculating kind that rattles silverware, and when she spoke her voice had gone soft in that way she considers maternal, telling me I was dredging up painful memories and should be ashamed of myself for turning grief into money, as if grief had not been turned into money years ago while I was buying thrift store office blouses and calling them a look. I let her finish her catechism about gratitude and family harmony, then said, in a tone I wished I'd learned years earlier, that harmony has a cost, and I had been the one paying it with interest, and that I would prefer not to argue, because the insurer would keep records better than either of us. She shifted to the new tactic, the offended aristocrat who dabs her eyes with a cocktail napkin and accuses you of vulgarity, and asked whether I planned to humiliate her by making a scene. To which I replied that a scene requires an audience and I was done performing, though I would be sending a short message so that no one could claim shock later when envelopes arrived and pens were uncapped in offices that did not serve cake. She called me cruel, which is the word people use when they meet your boundary and mistake the bruise on their forehead for your intention, and I said I had errands and hung up because nothing fuels manipulation like the invitation to continue it. My hands shook a little after, not from fear exactly, more from the body catching up to the part of me that had decided I was an adult who would not negotiate her own worth down to something palatable. The practical work of leaving braided itself into the practical work of telling the truth. I scanned the documents into a single PDF labeled with dates and policy numbers. I booked a one-way to Lisbon for 3 weeks out because the fares were kinder on Tuesdays and because I wanted just enough runway to lift off without lurching, and I set 3 calendar reminders titled Claim File Follow-Up, Certified Mail Receipt, and Return Grandma's Pie Dish, because even revolutions need housekeeping. Then I wrote the most satisfying email of my adult life, not a manifesto or a scream, just a concise, lawyerly paragraph addressed to my mother and Daniel with the subject line receipt, to which I attached the PDF and a single sentence that said I would be filing a formal request for the full administrative record of Dad's policy and expected both of them to preserve any messages, forms, or signatures related to the distribution, and that future communication on this topic should be in writing. I CC'd my aunt who has a memory like a library and always pretends to be neutral until the catalog shows a missing book, and I blind copied myself at a separate address I keep for anything I don't want lost to family theatrics. For dessert, because I believe in poetic symmetry even when I'm being ruthlessly practical, I walked the envelope to the copier at the 24-hour FedEx around the corner, made 2 clean sets, and slid one into a bright red folder labeled Travel. That went straight into my carry-on next to the passport and the ring my grandmother wore whenever she felt too small for a room. My revenge for the night, small and devastating in equal measure, was not a confrontation that would feed my mother's gift for denial, but a new velocity of truth. The claim letters drafted and ready, the scans out in the world where deletion is difficult. The group who laughed at the toast now holding a policy that looked, unromantically, like intent. When I stepped back into the October air and felt the wind lift my hair like a hand checking my temperature, my phone buzzed with a new family message from Daniel saying we should talk before we escalate, and I smiled in the way a person smiles when escalators finally move in the right direction, because the next step would not be a fight in a dining room, but a timestamp in a system that does not care who is the favorite at Thanksgiving. 2 days after the envelope turned from paper into a plan, Daniel texted a carefully cheerful invitation to swing by Mom's for coffee and an adult conversation, a phrase that floated like a scented candle over a bonfire. And, because I prefer my detonations controlled, I said yes, packed the red folder with the scans, tucked the notarized request beneath my passport like a talisman against gaslighting, and drove over with the kind of deliberate calm that makes people who run on drama check their mirrors. The house wore its usual pageant makeup, the wreath adjusted to imply generosity, the good pillows fluffed into a softness they did not extend to the people who sat on them. And when I stepped inside, my mother greeted me with the sad smile posture of a woman rehearsing grief for a committee, her hand soft on my elbow as if she were shepherding a fragile guest and not the adult daughter who had learned to balance her own plates. Daniel hovered near the dining table with a legal pad like a summer intern, his eyes sliding to the red folder and back to me with the sheepish defiance of a man convinced the universe rewards initiative when men practice it and punishes entitlement when women name it. We sat where we always sit for rituals that pretend to be conversations, the table still smelling faintly of frosting and the last war. And before anyone could launch an opening statement, I set down 3 identical paper envelopes I had labeled in block letters, Mom, Daniel, Archive, and told them, in a voice so even I could hear the metronome behind it, that each contained a copy of the policy, the clerk's notation, and my letter requesting the administrative record, and that I had dated and initialed every page so the family grapevine would have to work overtime to misreport the vintages. My mother inhaled sharply through her nose, that sound she makes when she remembers she is a soprano not a brawler, and asked whether I really wanted to drag our father's memory through this, to which I replied that memory had been dragged already, quietly and efficiently, into a condo deed, and that I was merely offering it a seat at the table. Daniel tried the reconciliation voice, all reasonable syllables and soft edges, telling me that Mom had made a judgment call during a very difficult time, that I hadn't been stable then, and that cash without conditions might have hurt me. A philosophy that would be touching if it hadn't coincidentally produced granite countertops and a home office for his podcast, and I watched my mother nod along like a metronome suddenly relieved of its burden to keep time, which was when I reached into my bag and placed a small square speaker in the center of the table, pressed play, and let her birthday toast fill the room exactly as it had filled it then. The line about not a cent ringing in the same air now, only without laughter to soften its joints. I did not watch their faces because I had been trained not to audit expressions for permission. I watched the framed photo on the sideboard instead, the one of my father at a community fundraiser with one arm around each of us, his eyes crinkled not with pride or disappointment, but with that simple human relief that you get to stand beside the people you love without having to explain why. I stopped the audio at the clink of glasses and, before anyone could move the conversation onto the soft carpets of tone and intention, slid a pen across to my mother and asked her to sign the receipt acknowledging she had received the materials and understood I would be corresponding in writing with the insurer, with copies kept and sent certified, and that I expected no further discussion of my character to substitute for arithmetic. Her hand trembled, which would have broken me a year ago and still twanged some old wire in my chest, but she signed because even performers know when the stage manager has turned on the work lights and pointed at the exit. As she lifted the pen, I stood, walked to the sideboard, and performed the pettiest, truest act of housekeeping I have ever allowed myself. I removed the glossy 8x10 of Daniel cutting a ribbon at some forgettable event and replaced it with the fundraiser photo of our father holding both children at equal height, propping it. So the glass caught the same light that had once made his laugh lines look like commas rather than warnings, and said, without turning around, that fairness looks best under natural light. There was a moment, thin as paper, sharp as a page edge, when my mother almost said the sentence that always comes next in this play, the one about family being all you have and girls like me being ungrateful for the roof and the rides and the values. But she swallowed it, maybe because the notary seal still shone faintly blue on the letter in front of her, maybe because, for once, she understood that arguments bounce off stamps the way hail bounces off a steel roof, noisy but inconsequential. I slid my copy back into the red folder, told them my flight was booked for 3 Tuesdays from now and that I would send them my mailing address once I had one that felt like mine, and added that, as of this afternoon, I had removed my payment methods from any accounts I had been helping with, including streaming services, the security system subscription, and the grocery delivery login. She used to treat me like an unpaid assistant, and that if they needed technical support, Daniel could surely figure it out, given his celebrated initiative. I left before they could marshal a farewell, pausing only in the doorway to do one last thing I will not apologize for, even if I live to be 100 and write a dozen apologies. I turned back to the dining room, lifted my glass of water off the table as if giving a toast, and said, in that same calm voice that had undone her on her birthday, that I wished them an honest afternoon, because honest afternoons tend to make honest evenings, which is how honest lives start. And then I put the glass down and walked into the unseasonably warm October outside, where the trees were still pretending summer. And I drove straight to the post office, where I slid 2 certified envelopes across the counter and watched the clerk stamp them with a finality so beautiful I almost cried. My revenge for the day, both practical and wickedly neat, was already in the mail, but I allowed myself one more flourish that no one would trace back to me except in the way that counts, on my way to the airport to pick up a friend. I stopped by the church office where my mother chairs committees and, with the secretary's permission, replaced the bulletin photo on the foyer corkboard, the one of Mom and Daniel smiling under a banner about stewardship, with the fundraiser photo of my father and his 2 children, a quiet correction in a public place, a story retuned without a speech, and as I stepped back onto the sidewalk, my phone lit up with a message from an unknown number containing a single image of handwriting I recognized instantly as my father's, followed by the words, "We need to talk before you go," and I stood very still while the plane stitched white seams across the sky and decided that the next conversation would take place exactly where I chose it to. The unknown number turned out not to be a stranger playing detective, but the attorney who had handled my father's policy back when paper still smelled like carbon copy and people kept files in metal drawers that groaned, and the photo he sent, a grainy phone capture of a note clipped to the back of a beneficiary update form in my father's narrow, practical handwriting, said only that both children were to be treated equally because, as he put it without poetry, love was not a contest and grief should never be leveraged into an advantage, which was not the smoking gun that makes a courtroom gasp, but it was enough to anchor what I already knew in my bones, that truth is rarely dramatic and almost always legible. We met in a coffee shop where the pastry case held the kind of tarts that look better than they taste, and he explained, in the careful cadence of a person who dislikes lawsuits but respects paper, that a request for the administrative record creates a chain of custody that people do not enjoy wriggling under, that clerks track edits and emails remember what they are asked to forget, and that if I was ready to hold my line without shouting, I would likely wind up with a correction that arrived looking nothing like a victory parade and everything like a wire transfer and an apology that used passive voice like a shield. I thanked him, signed 2 more request forms that sounded boring enough to be powerful, and walked out into a wind that smelled like rain and mulch, the air of a city putting itself to bed with chores. In the 3 weeks before my flight, I lived like a custodian of small dignities, returning casserole dishes that had sat in my cabinet like obligations, closing out accounts that had cleverly disguised themselves as favors, and packing my life into 3 suitcases with the precision of a nurse prepping a tray. Each item asked out loud whether it had earned its place, which is a ridiculous ritual until you do it and realize you have been paying rent for objects that enjoyed your company more than you enjoyed theirs. The certified receipts arrived in a diagonal stack that pleased me, and then, with the inevitability of a ball rolling toward a gutter and then stubbornly refusing to drop, the insurer's reply landed. The administrative file would be produced. A review would be conducted regarding the distribution in light of new documentation, and future correspondence would be directed to all named parties, which is legal phrasing for the simple fact that I was now in the room, and it is astonishing how much lighter you breathe when someone stops narrating your absence as your fault. On my last Sunday, I walked into my mother's church foyer at a quiet hour, and while I did not touch the bulletin board again, temptation is not a mandate, I did leave a sealed envelope at the office addressed to the Stewardship Committee, which contained a short note stating that, upon resolution of the policy review, I would be establishing the Carter Equal Start Scholarship at the local community college in my father's name, earmarked for students who carry more family expectation than family support, and that initial funding would equal whatever portion of the policy had been intended for me plus the accumulated interest my absence had cost me. Because there is more than one way to correct a ledger, and some of them do not require your rival to admit anything. The revenge in that letter was not theatrical, yet it was sharp, because my mother has built an entire chapter of her identity on public generosity that costs her little and controls much, and the knowledge that her favorite narrative, I protected the family from Emily's chaos, would soon have to compete with a list of scholarship recipients whose thank you notes would be framed in offices she never enters was a quiet thud I could feel even as I sealed the flap. I left on a Tuesday that looked like any other, airport coffee bitter, and the security line a slow river of shoes and trays, and when the plane lifted I felt not triumph, but a steady, almost bureaucratic relief. The kind you feel when a form finally accepts your login, and that sensation surprised me in the best way, because it meant I had not built my new life on adrenaline but on process, which is less glamorous and far more durable. Lisbon received me with laundry lines bright as flags and sidewalks that test your ankles, and I rented a small place with a stubborn door and a window that caught the afternoon light just right, and I learned the tram routes the way you learn a person, by paying attention to their pauses, and I sent clients my new time zone while holding a mug that did not belong to any memory but the one I was making. Some nights, a kind of ache would pass through me like weather, and I would think of my mother arranging her kitchen by color and Daniel recording an episode about productivity in a room that hummed with inherited quiet, and I would almost draft a message saying something soft and pointless, and then the ache would pass because feelings are not mandates either, and I would let the window turn gold without naming it. The administrative file arrived as a link that required two-factor authentication, which satisfied some deep part of me that enjoys locks, and the review concluded with the kind of language attorneys use when they are being precise and careful, acknowledging an error in the beneficiary processing and outlining a corrective distribution that would be executed upon receipt of standard forms, which I filled out without ceremony. And a week later my bank app updated with a number that made me sit down on the bed and breathe with my whole back, not because money is salvation, but because it is the exact shape of certain doors opening. I sent one email to the Community College Foundation director, who replied with immediate confidence and a gratitude that did not grovel, and we drew up paperwork that included a sentence I insisted on in plain language. Equal start does not mean equal outcome. It means no one gets their knees kicked out at the starting line, which felt like the closest I could get to my father's plain wisdom without copying his handwriting. I did not call my mother to tell her any of this, because the people who taught me that attention is currency do not get my headlines for free, yet I know news travels the way dandelion seeds do. And 2 mornings after the scholarship announcement posted to the college's alumni page, an email arrived from her address with a subject line that said, "Housekeeping," and inside there was no apology and no confession. Just a single sentence asking for my overseas mailing address for estate purposes. At some point, which could mean anything from a decoy olive branch to the dull truth that paperwork comes for all of us eventually. I stared at that sentence for a long time and did nothing, because silence is not apathy when it is a choice, and then I opened a second email. This one from Daniel with a photo of the fundraiser picture back on the sideboard and a caption that said, "He would have hated all of this," which might be true, or it might be Daniel's way of returning the spotlight to a man who cannot contradict him, and I typed and erased 3 replies before closing the app and walking down to the river to watch the water mind its own gravity. If there is a neat ending, it is not available to me yet, and I find that oddly respectful of reality, because families do not turn into better versions of themselves on your timetable, and victories do not arrive with brass bands, and letters with notary seals do not heal childhood. They only change the terms of adult life, which is enough for now. My final revenge, if that is even the right word for something that tastes more like clarity than sweetness, is that I built a boundary sturdy enough to lean on, and then built a bridge of my own choosing on the far side. And if one day an envelope arrives with my name written in my mother's careful script, and inside there is something that feels like a key rather than a blade, I will decide then whether to test the lock. But tonight I will stand in a kitchen that no one inspected and cut a slice of store-bought cake that owes nothing to performance, and I will raise a glass not to winning, but to ending a game I did not agree to play, and if that sounds like peace, it is only because I have finally stopped negotiating the price of it.